50 years ago, a group of self-described revolutionaries did something that shocked the world. In just 2 years, they declared war on America, assassinated a beloved school superintendent, robbed several banks, bombed several police cars, murdered an innocent bystander, kidnapped heiress Patty Hearst, and convinced her to join their cause before most of the group burned to death in a fiery shootout in Los Angeles right on live television. This webcast is about everything that made that story possible, and almost none of it is what I expected to find when I started looking. I came to this project with a set of beliefs about the Symbionese Liberation Army and the era that produced them. I had to dismantle most of those beliefs before I could tell this story honestly. This is the story of who the SLA really were, what they actually believed, and what it tells us about a nation that is still grappling with the same failures that produced them. This is House on Fire, Patty Hearst, the SLA, and the Seduction of Revolution. The booking sheet asked a routine question. What is your occupation? Patricia Hearst's answer, urban guerrilla, moved through every newsroom in the country within hours, faster even than the photographs of her, thin and red-haired, being led from the Morris Street apartment. 19 months of uncertainty had just ended. In Hillsborough, Randy and Catherine Hearst absorbed the news secondhand through television and radio reports that arrived faster than direct word from the FBI. Their daughter was alive. That fact alone was the thing they had wanted most for a year and a half. Through the kidnapping and the terror of not knowing, the bank robbery and the fire in Los Angeles that had, for one unbearable stretch of hours, threatened to have taken her too. She was alive and she was safe. She had not been rescued, though. She had been arrested, captured as a fugitive with weapons, identifying herself without hesitation as a soldier of the organization that had spent 2 years committing murder, kidnapping, and robbery. The relief Randy and Catherine felt arrived bundled with dread about what came next. For the country, the arrest didn't answer the question that had been building since the Hibernia security cameras developed their film 17 months earlier. It reopened it with the same intensity as the day those photographs first ran. Was this a victim, found at last after a long and harrowing captivity, or was it a criminal, finally caught after running as long and as far as she could? The arrest gave the public new material to argue about. The fist raised toward photographers from the back of the squad car, the calm, matter-of-fact way she'd stated her occupation, but it didn't give them an answer. For Patricia herself, what followed was its own kind of disorientation. A jail cell, a team of attorneys assembling almost immediately around her case. And after a year and a half of complete separation, her first sustained contact with the family she had spent that time describing on tape in language that had been by turns hostile, dismissive, and contemptuous. Word of the Harrises' arrest reached Steve Salia on the radio, and his instinct was to get to Patricia before anyone else did. He drove to the Morris Street apartment, intending to warn her that she might be next. He was too late. Federal agents had already moved on the apartment, and Steve was arrested the same afternoon. What the Bureau failed to account for was the painting crew in Pacifica. The agents who had spent weeks tracking Steve, Kathy, and Josephine Salia through their daily job site never secured that location on the day of the arrests, and by the time anyone thought to, word had already reached the rest of the crew. Kathy and Josephine Salia, along with Jim Kilgore and Michael Borton, simply didn't show up for the rest of their shift. They disappeared instead, beginning new lives under new identities that would, in some cases, holed for decades before anyone recognized them in public again. Patricia spent her first night in custody at the San Mateo County Jail. Her parents came that evening along with her sisters Vicky and Anne, carrying a bouquet of roses that reporters camped outside had handed them on their way in. Jail policy didn't allow her to keep the flowers in her cell. The visit itself was short and awkward, but a relief. What the Hearsts could confirm, at least, was that their daughter was alive. What they found physically was someone considerably changed from the young woman they thought they knew. Thin to the point of frailty, her hair cut short and dyed red with a home kit, the visual evidence of what the preceding 19 months had done to her body was immediate and impossible to look past. Patricia had spent months the year before calling her mother a drunken reactionary, her father a corporate liar, her family collectively the kind of people she would never choose to live among again. She had said on a recording broadcast to the entire country that she felt nothing but contempt for the life she'd left behind. Now she was sitting across from the people she'd said those things about, and none of it could simply be unsaid. Randy and Catherine were left holding two competing certainties. Their daughter had been kidnapped, held in a closet, isolated and indoctrinated under conditions the series has spent multiple episodes documenting in detail, and their daughter had also, by every external measure, become someone who chose to stay, chose to rob banks, chose to fire a weapon into a crowded street outside Mel's Sporting Goods, chose to bomb police vehicles. Loving her again meant holding both of those things at once and praying that the real Patty could return to them. For Patricia, the adjustment ran in the opposite direction. She had spent 19 months being told, consistently and by the only people available to tell her anything, that her family had failed her, that the PIN food program had been a tax dodge, that her parents cared more about appearances than about getting her back, that Stephen Weed was exactly the kind of man her old life had trained her to settle for. Whatever portion of that she had actually believed, as opposed to recited, was not something she or anyone else could cleanly sort out in a county jail visiting room in the days immediately following her arrest. Within days, the family retained F. Lee Bailey as lead defense counsel, a choice that signaled immediately the scale of legal firepower the Hearsts intended to bring to bear. Bailey was already one of the most recognized criminal defense attorneys in the country, known for a string of high-profile cases that had made him a celebrity in his own right. His selection was a statement that the Hearst family intended to fight this on every available front, with resources that almost no other defendant in American history facing comparable charges could have assembled. The strategy that began taking shape in those early weeks centered on the argument that Patricia's actions, however criminal they appeared on their face, had been the product of coercion so total and so sustained that they could not be fairly judged as the product of her own free will. It was a difficult argument to make to an American jury, not because the underlying psychological reality was implausible, but because the legal system had no existing framework for evaluating it, and the public had already spent 2 years watching footage that seemed, on its face, to settle the question in the opposite direction. Bailey's team began assembling psychiatric evaluations, expert testimony, a narrative arc that would need to take a jury back to that closet in Daly City, the lectures, the isolation, all the way forward to a young woman holding a carbine in a San Francisco bank, and beyond that, another year and a half. Whether that arc would hold together in a courtroom, under close examination, in front of 12 people who had also seen the same footage everyone else had seen, was the question the defense now had less than a year to answer. "5 days after her arrest, Patricia signed an affidavit describing a year and a half she could barely account for in her own memory. Everything between the Hibernia robbery on April 15, 1974, and her arrest on September 18, 1975, she said, existed for her in something closer to a fog than a sequence of clear memories, a prolonged state in which she had been unable to reliably distinguish what was actually happening from what she feared or imagined was happening, sustained throughout by what she described as constant terror. She swore to the truth of this account under penalty of perjury on a Monday, the day after she had written her first letter to Steve Solia since the arrest. A small but telling detail about the order in which her loyalties and her legal strategy were beginning to separate from each other. Privately, Randy Hearst told F. Lee Bailey that his deepest worry wasn't Hibernia or Mel's Sporting Goods. It was Carmichael, the Crocker National Bank robbery, the one where Myrna Opsahl had died. The evidence connecting Patricia to that operation was, at this early stage, considerably weaker than the evidence tying her to the other two incidents. Yet Randy understood, even before the legal team had fully mapped out its strategy, that this was the case's most dangerous exposure. Bailey made his first visit to the San Mateo County Jail to meet his new client on Friday, September 26th, just over a week after her arrest. The legal maneuvering accelerated quickly, and not always in directions that helped Patricia's co-defendants. Steve Solia was denied a reduction in his bail in part because of comments Patricia made during a jail visit, comments everyone involved should have known were being recorded, since visiting room conversations in cases of this profile were standard surveillance targets. The recorded conversation became almost immediately evidence used against the people she had been talking to. The concept that would eventually anchor much of the defense's public framing, brainwashing, had a peculiar history of its own, one that mattered enormously to how a jury was likely to receive it. The term had taken hold far more firmly in popular culture than in clinical psychiatry. It carried the flavor of Cold War anxiety, the fear that an authoritarian system could reach inside a person's mind and rebuild their convictions from the outside against their will without their knowledge that it had even happened. Richard Condon's 1959 novel, The Manchurian Candidate, and the 1962 film it inspired had given the fear its most durable cultural form. A Korean War prisoner returned home as an unwitting assassin, programmed by enemies he couldn't consciously remember. By the time Patricia's case reached trial, brainwashing functioned in the public imagination less as a clinical diagnosis than as a description, a word for the general experience of being made to believe something against one's will, with no agreed-upon mechanism, no settled symptoms, and no real legal precedent for how a court should weigh it. This was the term the defense would have to work with and work around, in front of a jury that had absorbed the word mostly from spy novels and presidential campaigns rather than from anything resembling rigorous psychiatric literature. Patricia herself wanted none of this. She had spent more than a year being asked by one set of people or another to account for what she believed and why, and by the time she was back in contact with her family, what she wanted most was to stop talking about the SLA entirely. She was exhausted by the parade of psychiatrists her own defense required her to sit with, exhausted by the retelling, exhausted by the consistent demand that she narrate her own captivity over and over for an audience of professionals trying to determine what it had done to her. She testified eventually about why she had presented herself as a committed convert rather than a victim during her time with the SLA. She said she had been told repeatedly that her parents weren't actually trying to secure her release, that their public efforts were calculated instead to humiliate the organization and provoke them into killing her. Bailey asked her directly why, given that belief, she had wanted the SLA to think she'd genuinely joined them. "So I could stay alive," she said. He asked whether she had been convinced at the time that refusing to join would have gotten her killed. The answer she gave was yes. The prosecution's answer to all of this was simpler and in some ways more intuitive to a jury that had spent nearly 2 years watching the same footage everyone else had watched. She had multiple opportunities to escape and never took them. She picked up a weapon and used it, at Hibernia and again at Mel's, firing 30 rounds into a public street to protect people who were, by her own defense's account, also her captors. She recorded tapes that, heard without the surrounding psychological context the defense was asking the jury to accept, sounded like conviction rather than coercion. A woman explaining in detail and at length why she had chosen this life. The prosecution didn't need a sophisticated theory of psychology to make its case. It needed only the same security camera footage and the same recordings that had already convicted Patricia Hearst in the court of public opinion months earlier. The relationship between Patricia and the Harrises, meanwhile, was unraveling in real time. In the days immediately following the arrests, Bill and Emily had been genuinely sympathetic to Patricia. They were living separately from her by September 1975, but they still respected what they understood as her authentic political transformation. When attorney Terrence Hallinan visited Bill in jail shortly after his arrest, Bill told him plainly that he and Emily would do whatever Patricia needed, testify that she'd been kidnapped, say whatever helped her case. That goodwill didn't survive F. Lee Bailey's arrival. Once Bailey took over and began cutting off Patricia's contact with Steve Salia and the rest of her former comrades, the Harrises felt the change immediately. And it hardened into open hostility once word reached them that Patricia was characterizing her relationships within the SLA, specifically with Willie Wolfe, and the question of whether DeFreeze had ever had sex with her, in terms of coercion rather than consent. The Harrises pushed back hard and publicly. They insisted that her relationship with Wolfe had been entirely consensual, that DeFreeze had never had any sexual contact with Patricia at all, and that the SLA's own internal politics, built, they argued, around feminist principles, with more women in the organization than men, would never have tolerated rape among its own members. Like many of my own preconceived ideas about this story, I had to wrestle with this information. It was believable that Patricia had verbally consented to sex with DeFreeze, not wanting to be seen as racist, but not actually willing. Legally, it is rape because Hearst, like a child in a statutory situation, did not have the means to consent.
But the Harrises have never deviated from that disavowal.
That they were certain she and Sing Hugh had not had sexual relations. Not that it wasn't assault, but that it simply did not happen at all. I had to consider that by the end of Patricia's 59 days in the closet, nobody in the SLA had freedom of movement. Camilla Hall had been the last to have any safe movement to and from the safe house, and I had not read of any instances when either Bill or Emily had spent time away, time in which things could have occurred without their knowledge. They were well aware that Patricia and Willie were having sex, that in fact they had to be asked for approval when Patricia told Angela Atwood that she wanted to be intimate with Wolfe. How then could it be possible that they weren't aware she also had sex with Donald DeFreeze? There's no easy answer. I could not determine if this meant she had been dishonest, whether Bill and Emily were trying to protect their former field general marshal in absentia, or if this falls into another gray area that cannot be reconciled. All we can determine is that Tanya was no longer loyal to the SLA or to Tico and Yolanda, her former comrades, and the trials hadn't even started yet. F. Lee Bailey had built his career on a specific kind of courtroom performance. Confident, theatrical, willing to take cases that seemed unwinnable and make juries believe, at least for the duration of the trial, that the unwinnable case had a path to victory. He had defended Sam Shepard and members of the Boston Strangler investigation. He moved through a courtroom less like a litigator working through evidence and more like a man delivering a verdict he had already decided was correct, daring the jury to disagree with him. That persona was both an asset and a liability in a case like this one. Bailey's confidence could make an unconventional defense feel plausible simply by the force of his presentation. But that same showmanship invited skepticism from a jury that spent months watching genuine unscripted footage of Patricia Hearst with a carbine in her hands, footage that didn't require a famous lawyer's interpretation to understand. Bailey was asking 12 people to disbelieve their own eyes on the strength of his argument that what looked like willing participation was in fact the visible surface of psychological coercion they couldn't directly observe. The argument itself rested on a concept the legal system had no real precedent for evaluating: duress so total and so sustained that it overrode the defendant's free will for the better part of a year and a half, encompassing not just the original kidnapping, but the bank robbery, the gunfire outside Mel's Sporting Goods, everything recorded on tape in between, and another year and a half on the run, committing robberies and bombings. Bailey built his case around expert testimony describing what amounted to coercive persuasion, the mechanics this series has spent several episodes documenting in detail: isolation, manufactured dependency, total information control, the systematic replacement of one identity with another under conditions a person cannot escape. The language that would eventually attach itself most durably to this case, Stockholm Syndrome, entered the broader American vocabulary substantially through this trial. Bailey's team didn't invent the concept, but the scale and visibility of Patricia's case did more than anything before or since to fix it in the public imagination as a recognizable, almost familiar phenomenon, a label confident enough to sound clinical, even though the underlying psychiatric consensus was still being formed in real time. The obstacles facing this argument in 1976 were not primarily about the quality of the underlying psychology. They were cultural and tactical. The country had spent now 2 years consuming this story, primarily through visual evidence: the Hibernia security camera stills, the news footage of Mel's, the photograph of a raised fist inside a squad car on the day of her arrest. Each of those images carried an intuitive, immediate legibility that didn't require any psychological framework to interpret. A woman with a gun looked like a woman who had chosen to carry a gun. The defense was asking a jury to set aside that intuitive reading in favor of a more complicated account that required them to trust expert testimony over their own eyes at a moment in American legal history when expert psychiatric testimony of this kind had little established track record in criminal defense and even less public credibility. There was also the cultural context of who was making this argument and on whose behalf. Patricia Hearst was the granddaughter of one of the most powerful media families in American history, defended by one of the most expensive and famous attorneys money could buy. However genuinely the underlying coercion had occurred, the jury was also being asked to extend a level of psychological sympathy to a Hearst that the legal system rarely extended to defendants without comparable resources. That asymmetry didn't make the duress argument false. It made it, in the climate of a country already exhausted by Watergate-era cynicism about power and privilege, a much harder sell than it might have been for a less famous defendant making an identical claim. The prosecution didn't need to construct anything elaborate. Its entire case could be built from material the public had already absorbed and largely already judged. The Hibernia photographs, the 30 rounds fired into a busy street outside Mel's Sporting Goods to protect the people who had supposedly been holding her against her will. The fist raised toward photographers on the day of her arrest, a gesture that, whatever its actual meaning, read to most observers as defiant pride rather than the reflexive posture of a victim relieved to finally be free. The prosecution simply had to remind the jury what they had already seen and believed, walking them back through evidence that had been shaping public opinion for 2 years before the trial even began. The jury returned a guilty verdict. Patricia Hearst was convicted on the charges connected to the Hibernia bank robbery and sentenced to 7 years. Bill and Emily Harris faced their own mounting legal exposure, charged in connection with the kidnapping of Tom Matthews and facing the looming possibility of indictment in Myrna Opsahl's death. Their difficulty, compounding the financial strain of mounting a defense, was that they were in fact guilty of essentially everything they were charged with, a circumstance that limited their lawyers' options considerably, even as those lawyers managed some genuine early victories, successfully arguing that the warrantless search of the apartment on Presida Avenue had been unlawful and that evidence recovered there couldn't be used against them. What the Harrises lacked was money. Robbing additional banks to fund their defense was, for obvious reasons, no longer an option. What they had instead was their story, and they set about monetizing it with the same meticulous attention they'd brought to everything else in their lives. The previous summer, Jack Scott had tried to get Bill, Emily, and Patricia to collaborate on a book, and the project had collapsed for lack of patience and aptitude on everyone's part. Conventional news outlets wanted interviews, but couldn't pay for them under standard journalistic ethics. Their attorney, Leonard Weinglass, eventually brokered a different arrangement through the journalist Robert Scheer, who wrote for New Times, a national publication that blended countercultural sensibility with glossy production values and, crucially, wasn't bound by the same ethical restrictions against paying sources. New Times offered $10,000 for an extended interview. Scheer and a colleague, Susan Line, spent 14 hours with Bill and Emily inside the Los Angeles County Jail. True to form, the Harrises didn't simply sit for the interview. They annotated and expanded the transcripts afterward with the same obsessive thoroughness that had characterized their entire time in the SLA. Bill adding handwritten corrections, Emily retyping clean copy on a prison typewriter. The resulting piece ran in print just before the close of evidence in Patricia's trial, an uncomfortable bit of timing that put the Harrises' own account of events into public circulation at precisely the moment a jury was weighing competing narratives about what had actually happened inside the SLA. Among Emily's contributions was a small, oddly tender detail about the Olmec monkey pendant Willie Wolfe had given Patricia, how he'd braided a cord for it himself out of waxed string lying around the house, how Patricia had worn it constantly until the shootout, after which she carried it in her purse instead, but never stopped keeping it close. It wound up being a significant factor in Patricia's guilty verdict. She claimed during her trial testimony that she had in fact hated Willie Wolfe, and yet she was still carrying the gift he had given her well over a year after his death in the Los Angeles shootout and inferno. On January 29, 1979, President Carter signed a commutation of the remainder of Patricia Hearst's sentence. He offered no public comment, no explanation, no statement justifying the decision, simply ending her imprisonment after she had served roughly 22 months of a 7-year term. 2 months later, on April 1st, 1979, 25-year-old Patricia married Bernard Shaw, a police officer who had served as part of her security detail during the trial. The wedding came quickly after her release, and the life that followed it was, by design, deliberately ordinary. They settled into a modest home south of San Francisco, where Bernard continued working as an officer. Patricia remained on probation for another 2 years, during which she kept busy with hobbies. She trained beagles to detect termites. She did some fundraising for a child care center named after Congressman Leo Ryan, who had publicly advocated for her release before his death in Guyana in the Jonestown massacre. She spent a great deal of time horseback riding. Each month, dutifully, she filled out the form her probation officer required, listing her occupation not as urban guerrilla, but as unemployed. The publishing industry, unsurprisingly, wanted her story in her own words, and in the early 1980s, she received an advance of $600,000, among the largest sums ever paid for a nonfiction book to that point. She worked with a ghostwriter to produce the manuscript while nursing her first child, a daughter named Jillian, born in 1981. The book, eventually published as Every Secret Thing, became her own formal accounting of the kidnapping and its aftermath, an account that would, for decades afterward, sit alongside the Harris's competing version of events, the two narratives never fully reconciling on several key points, particularly regarding the nature of her relationships within the SLA. The years that followed settled into a pattern that mixed ordinary domestic life with the recurring demands of remaining a recognizable public figure attached permanently to one of the most famous criminal cases in American history. She had a second daughter, Lydia, in 1984. Her marriage to Bernard Shaw endured for decades, a stability that stood in deliberate contrast to the chaos of the years immediately following her kidnapping. She found an unexpected niche later in her life, appearing in small film roles, several of them for the director John Waters, who cast her in a string of his films beginning in the early 90s. A collaboration that had a particular knowing irony to it, given Waters' long-standing interest in American transgression and celebrity, and given that Patricia herself had become, whether she wanted the role or not, one of the most enduring symbols of both. She also became active in dog breeding and showing, eventually achieving real success and recognition within that world. She was in every way the society matron that her earlier life had anticipated for her, but with a tinge of rebelliousness and shock value that her 19 months with the SLA had also forged in her. Carter's presidential commutation had ended her prison sentence in 1979, but a commutation is not a pardon. It shortens punishment without erasing the underlying conviction. And Patricia Hearst remained, on paper, a convicted felon for the next 2 decades. She had 2 particularly influential allies in her eventual pursuit of a full pardon, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, both of whom maintained a personal investment in her case that outlasted his presidency by more than 20 years. On December 4th, 2000, in the middle of the contested vote recount that would eventually decide that year's presidential election, the former president wrote directly to Bill Clinton. He noted that among the many pardon applications pending, hers was one he had followed closely for a long time. A pardon, he explained, would represent the nation's formal forgiveness for actions that had occurred during her captivity. Actions whose ultimate meaning, he wrote, she hoped to be able to explain to her own 2 daughters, now nearly grown themselves, with the weight of an actual presidential acknowledgement behind it, rather than just her own account. A month later, with only 10 days remaining in Clinton's presidency, Rosalind Carter sent a handwritten fax of her own. She made the case in simpler terms than her husband had. Patricia had made a mistake, she wrote, but had spent the subsequent 24 years living an exemplary life. For her sake, and especially for the sake of her daughters, Rosalind asked Clinton to find it in himself to grant the pardon. Clinton scrawled his response directly on the fax cover sheet in the distinctive left-handed writing reporters had grown accustomed to seeing on margin notes throughout his presidency. I think I should do this, BC. On January 20th, 2001, his final day in office, Clinton included a full pardon for Patricia Hearst among the 140 pardons he issued that day, a batch of last-minute clemency decisions that would draw considerable controversy in the weeks and months that followed, for reasons having nothing to do with her case specifically. The public reaction to the pardon broke along lines that had been fixed since 1976 and showed no particular sign of softening with the passage of years. For people who had accepted some version of the coercion argument all along, the pardon was simply the formal, belated acknowledgement that should have come at trial. For people who had never accepted that argument, who believed Patricia Hearst had made genuine choices and deserved whatever consequences followed from them, the pardon read as one more example of wealth and connection securing outcomes that an ordinary defendant, lacking presidential support and a Hearst fortune behind them, would never have received. What the pardon accomplished legally was limited. It restored Patricia Hearst's full civil rights and formally closed the federal government's residual claim against her for the Hibernia robbery conviction. What it did not do was settle the underlying question this series has been circling since its earliest episodes. A pardon is an act of executive forgiveness, not a psychiatric finding and not a historical verdict. It does not determine whether the woman who robbed that bank had been, at the moment she did it, exercising free will in any meaningful sense or acting out the only self that months of isolation and indoctrination had left available to her. Justice for the SLA arrived on no consistent schedule and at no consistent intensity. Some served their time quickly and disappeared into ordinary American life within a few years. Others lived undisturbed under new names for decades before the past caught up with them. A few never faced any reckoning that matched the scale of what they had done. Theora Wheeler, who had walked away from the organization back in October 1973 after Sing-Q held a gun to his stomach over the decision to assassinate Marcus Foster, came closer than almost anyone to a clean escape. He tracked down the father who had abandoned him as a boy and built a tentative relationship with him in Houston. Despite being mistakenly named at one point as one of Patricia's kidnappers, he kept his head down under the name Bradley Bruce, eventually securing health coverage through his job that allowed him to finally treat a chronic intestinal condition that had plagued him for years, requiring the removal of half his lower intestine. He worked at an electric motor company, then at a company manufacturing burglar alarms. He watched the fire on East 54th Street unfold on television like everyone else, and it devastated him. "That choked me out," he said later. "It didn't seem real. All those lives wasted." His freedom ended by accident rather than investigation. Intervening in an unrelated scuffle, he took a superficial shotgun wound to his arm and went to a Houston hospital where a police officer ran his alias through a national database as routine procedure. The FBI arrested him at work without incident. His girlfriend and mother of his infant daughter had no idea who he actually was until that moment. He was extradited to California to serve time for the escape and complete his previous sentence. He was released in 1976, married, and died in 2009 in San Francisco. Joe Ramiro and Russell Little, arrested in Concord the month before Patricia's kidnapping, were tried together for Marcus Foster's murder, a crime, as this series established several episodes ago, neither of them had actually committed. The shooting had been carried out by DeFreeze, Soltysik, and Ling Perry, all three dead in Los Angeles before any appeal could correct the record. Without eyewitnesses to the actual shooting, the case against Ramiro and Little rested entirely on a conspiracy theory of liability, and after lengthy deliberation, both men were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. An appeals court later found that the judge in the original trial had improperly coerced the jury toward its verdict and ordered a new trial for Little. He was acquitted in that second trial and released in 1981, going on to spend decades working in information technology for schools. Ramiro's conviction stood, a reminder that not only had he been caught with one of the weapons used in the Foster assassination, but that he had fired that same gun at a police officer. By his late 60s, he had spent more than 40 years in the California prison system. A parole board recommended his release in 2015. He remained incarcerated for another 3 years. Wendy Yoshimura, arrested alongside Patricia in the Morris Street apartment, was convicted only on charges connected to her earlier relationship with Willie Brandt's bombing operation and served less than a year. She settled into a quiet, almost entirely apolitical life in Berkeley, working for years as a server at a co-op vegetarian restaurant, and eventually building a modest reputation as a watercolor artist, selling work through a personal website and at local shows. Jack Scott went on to a successful career as a physiotherapist for elite athletes, his early writing about the exploitation of college athletes proving considerably ahead of its time. He died of cancer in 2000 at 57. Steve Scalia, acquitted in the Carmichael robbery, returned to house painting and lived quietly in Berkeley until his death from a stroke in 2013 at 64. Stephen Weed left his graduate studies in philosophy behind entirely and became a real estate agent in Palo Alto. He and Patricia never spoke again after the night of February 4th, 1974. 3 of the group's remaining members became long-term fugitives after the September 1975 arrests, each disappearing for years before the past finally reached them. Jim Kilgore fled to South Africa, where he spent 27 years teaching and working in anti-apartheid activism before being extradited back to the United States in 2002. He pleaded guilty to charges connected to explosives and the Carmichael robbery, was released in 2009 and eventually settled in Illinois, where he wrote a book on mass incarceration as a civil rights issue. Michael Borton surrendered voluntarily in 1984, served 18 months for a parole violation, and relocated to Portland, where he married Josephine Scalia, Kathy and Steve's younger sister. He then spent several years running a small hardwood flooring business. Kathy Scalia's path was the longest and in its own way the most remarkable. She had delivered the eulogy for Angela Atwood at the Ho Chi Minh Park Memorial, the same event that first drew Emily Harris to seek her out, and had gone on to become one of the most committed members of the reconstituted SLA, central to the Carmichael robbery and the bombing campaign that followed it. After the September 1975 arrests, she fled to Minnesota, where she had lived part of her childhood. There she became Sarah Jane Olson, working first as a cook in a fraternity house, then meeting and marrying a medical student named Fred Peterson. The couple settled into a comfortable, unremarkable life in St. Paul, raising 3 daughters over the following 2 decades. Sarah Jane grew confident enough in her new identity to perform in amateur community theater productions, her photograph appearing on posters around the Twin Cities for anyone to see. The break came in May 1999, when America's Most Wanted ran a segment on Kathy Scalia's role in the attempted bombing of a police car in Los Angeles. 19 tips came in afterward, one of them pointing investigators directly to a 52-year-old soccer mom and gourmet cook in St. Paul's Highland Park neighborhood. The FBI compared photographs and arrested her on June 16th. Sarah Jane reacted to her arrest with indignation. She called the case against her a witch hunt. Released on bail, she devoted considerable energy to a cookbook fundraiser for her own defense, titled with a wink toward her own fugitive history, including an essay in which she reflected on the relationship between food, wealth, and power across different cultures. She hired experienced radical defense attorneys, and the case dragged through years of procedural maneuvering, still unresolved when the September 11th attacks reshaped the entire national conversation around terrorism and violence in ways nobody involved in the case could have anticipated. Bill Harris, after his April 1983 release, took a job as a receptionist in his attorney's San Francisco office, work that gradually evolved into a career as a private investigator. By the late 1990s, a well-regarded one, serving a broad range of Bay Area clients. Unlike Emily, he never fully abandoned his ideological commitments, but he redirected them into more conventional channels, particularly advocacy against prosecutorial overreach. In 1988, he married Rebecca Young, a respected San Francisco defense attorney, and they settled in Oakland and had 2 sons. The man who had once drilled the SLA through daily calisthenics now coached Pee Wee soccer. Emily was released from prison in May 1983. By then, the Harrises were divorced, and Emily was in a relationship with a woman. She moved to Los Angeles with her partner. She legally changed her surname and started an IT consulting company that worked with several film studios. Then came the reckoning that had been delayed for nearly 30 years. In the aftermath of September 11th, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office moved to finally close the cases connected to Myrna Opsahl's death and the attempted bombing outside the International House of Pancakes in 1975. Borton, Sarah Jane Olsen, Bill Harris, and Emily Schwartz, all now well into middle age, suddenly faced the real possibility of spending the remainder of their lives in prison for acts committed when they were in their 20s. Each of them approached the renewed prosecution differently. Olsen preferred press interviews, framing herself as a martyr to public conviction rather than seriously engaging with the evidence against her. Bill, encouraged by his second wife, believed he could win at trial on the strength of the case's age. The Crocker Bank building itself had long since been demolished, and he looked forward with apparent relish to cross-examining the prosecution's expected star witness, Patricia Hearst. Emily, by contrast, expressed what appeared to be genuine remorse and wanted simply to plead guilty and put the entire matter behind her. She told the judge about Myrna Opsahl and the victim's family, "I do not want them to believe that we ever considered her life insignificant." In the end, every defendant negotiated a plea. Bill and Emily each received 6-year sentences, though Emily's stretched to 8 because of her direct use of a firearm in Opsahl's death. When Kilgore was extradited from South Africa, he accepted the same arrangement. After 27 years, the Opsahl family finally received some measure of formal acknowledgement that a wrong had been done to them. Limited, imperfect, and decades late, but not nothing. Bill and Emily each served roughly 5 years, beginning in 2003, and the second imprisonment proved considerably harder than the first. American prisons are not built gently for people in their 50s. Emily struggled afterward to rebuild her consulting business in an industry that had transformed entirely during her absence. Bill's marriage didn't survive the separation, and his relationship with his son suffered along with it. Eventually, estranged from much of his family, he left Northern California for one of the most remote corners of the country, settling near his old comrade, Russell Little. And Patricia. She has by now given every public statement she intends to give about the 1.5 years of her life that began on a Monday evening on Benvenue Avenue and ended in a San Francisco apartment with federal agents at her door. She wrote her account once in her own book decades ago and has largely declined since then to revisit the subject for the benefit of new interviewers chasing a fresh angle on an old story. Her husband, Bernard Shaw, died in 2013 after more than 3 decades of marriage. She has grandchildren now, born to the daughters she raised largely outside the spotlight of either her family's notoriety or briefly her own. She is content with her chapter in history, leaving the rest of us, historians, webcasters, juries who never got to deliberate, and the country that watched it all unfold live on television, to keep arguing about what it actually meant. By the time Bill Clinton signed his name to that final batch of pardons, the legal story of the Symbionese Liberation Army was, for all practical purposes, finished. Verdicts had been rendered. Sentences had been served or commuted, or, in the case of 2 men convicted of a murder they didn't commit, never fully corrected. A A few years later, the last meaningful prosecutions had concluded. The Opsal family had received its overdue measure of acknowledgement, and the people who had once been revolutionaries had in nearly every case become something quieter. A private investigator coaching pee-wee soccer, a watercolor painter, a hardwood floor installer, a widow raising dogs in retirement. The legal record was closed. The cultural argument was not, and it was never going to be. What emerged in the years after the trial and hardened over the following decades into the default popular explanation was a single term, borrowed from a bank robbery in Sweden 2 years before Patricia's own kidnapping: Stockholm Syndrome. The term gave the public something it badly wanted: a clean, portable label for an experience that this series has spent 12 episodes arguing was neither clean nor simple. Say the phrase today, and most people nod immediately, confident they understand exactly what happened to her, even though the clinical concept underneath the label was barely a few years old at the time of her trial and remains even now a far more contested and limited diagnosis than its everyday usage suggests. The competing framework never went away either, and it remains, for a substantial portion of the public, the more persuasive one. In this version, Patricia Hearst was a privileged young woman who made an actual choice, committed actual crimes, and was handed a leniency that nobody without her surname and her family's resources would ever have received. This reading doesn't require any psychological sophistication to hold. It only requires looking at the security camera footage, the gunfire outside Mel's, the raised fist, and the concluding that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. Both of these frameworks have survived for 50 years, not because either one is obviously false, but because each gives people a way to stop thinking about the case rather than a way to actually understand it. That is what compartmentalization does. It is efficient. It is also, in this instance, a kind of loss.
Thank you for listening to House on Fire, Patty Hearst, the SLA, and the Seduction of Revolution. This is H. Allegra Lansing. This is a story about a country at war with itself, and about what happens when a generation's fury collapses into the worst possible reaction. The Symbionese Liberation Army did not fail because the injustice they saw wasn't real. They failed because they chose violence. And violence is the one form of resistance that entrenched power already knows how to defeat. It has been defeating it for centuries. Everyone swept up in the movement would pay a cost beyond measure, even an heiress to the nation's most powerful media empire. In our final episode of House on Fire, after 12 episodes, 2 questions still don't have clean answers. What actually happened to Patricia Hearst during her time in captivity with the SLA? And who exactly was Donald DeFreeze? The more you weigh both questions, the more uncertain those answers become. What do we truly know about the movement that produced both Tanya and Sin Q, and what it means for any of us still living inside the same American failures the SLA went to war with? The radical left of the early 1970s got almost everything wrong about how to fight. They may not have gotten everything wrong about what they were fighting. This webcast is based on historical records, contemporary reporting, and archival research. All writing and most narration by yours truly. Theme music is Red Shift by The Grey Room with Density and Time.